Alrighty. I want to welcome everybody to our last seminar series and talk of the fall semester. Today we're very lucky to have Dr. Elizabeth Yates with us. Um, she's a senior researcher at START at the University of Maryland, and today she's actually going to be speaking to us about hate crime in America and an empirical assessment. Dr. Yates, again, is a senior researcher on the domestic radicalization team at START. She works primarily in a suite of database sets associated with PRIUS, the Profiles of Individual Radicalization in the United States, and Bias Incidence and Actor Study, which use publicly available data to empirically analyze extremist radicalization trends in the United States. She is also a co-principal investigator on a multi-year NIJ-funded project studying extremism offender reintegration. Her focuses are especially on far-right violence, extremism, and hate crimes, and she has authored numerous papers in that research area, which is exactly how we came to find her, and we've enjoyed a number of her papers. In addition, Dr. Yates has taught undergraduate classes in terrorism studies and sociology, and she earned her doctorate in sociology at the University of Pittsburgh and a BA in international relations at Tufts University. So before we move on with Dr. Yates' presentation, we always have the same caveat as always, which is while this seminar series is certainly funded and supported by the Department of Homeland Security under the EnSite Center of Excellence, in no way does what the presenters say or what I say, they're not reflective of the views, opinions, or policies of the US government. So with that, we're gonna pass it off to Dr. Yates, and let's welcome and enjoy her talk.
Okay, thank you so much. So before I get started, I will just give you all a brief introduction to where I work, the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, or START. We are a research center associated with the University of Maryland. We were founded, I guess, many years ago now in a relationship with the Department of Homeland Security with the goal of improving the relationship between policymakers and practitioners trying to address terrorism and counterterrorism. Oh, man. All right, I have not had that happen so far in this pandemic. I am assuming that came from something on YouTube. I don't know. That was not me. Is everyone still here? Is everyone with me? Aiden, are we still, are we here?
I think so, Liz. This is Bill Branham. I can still hear you.
Okay, well, I'll just continue talking then. Okay, well, yeah. So anyway, START is a, thank you. START is a research center. We were tasked with improving the relationship between academics, creating rigorous empirical research, and that is what we are best known for. So we do host the Global Terrorism Database, the GTD, as well as PIRUS, which is the offender level database that I work on primarily, the Profiles of Individual Radicalization in the United States. And so those are the main projects in our office. What I'm going to talk about today is a more recent project that me and some of my teammates have worked on, which is the bias data set, which is similar to PIRUS in that it is an offender level look at the characteristics and crime variables associated with hate crime offenders. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started here. One second. So as this is loading here, looks like it's taking 1 second, but one of the main reasons that we wanted to undertake this bias crime research was to look at a really well-known offender typology. This was established, and I'll have some slides on it momentarily. I'm sorry, it just looks like it's being really slow here. There we go. Okay. So what we're going to look at, as I said, an assessment of this typology. So basically, there were some researchers, Levin and McDevitt, I'm sorry, in 1993, who looked at a series of hate crime offenses in the city of Boston over the course of 1991 and 90, I think, something like that. And they said, look, we think we can figure out what kinds of hate crime offenders are most likely to commit what kinds of hate crimes, right? And they thought, okay, this will be really useful for people trying to understand, for law enforcement, trying to say, okay, we have a hate crime, we have an incident here. What kind of person should we be looking for? What kinds of characteristics of the offender should we be looking for? What can we do from a preventative perspective? So when we think that's a certain kind of hate crime might be on the rise, who can we be looking at for interdiction or broader preventative services and that kind of thing. So that was the goal of that. And so something we did when we created the bias crime data set was to assess that. So I'm going to focus on that and end of our analysis specifically. This is still a little bit of a work in progress. So I'm hoping that this is an audience where there are practitioners and researchers who are invested in this analysis, who can engage with us on this topic. And one thing I would love some input on is a better name for this title: Hate Crime Offenders in the 21st Century: An Empirical Assessment of a Classic Typology. It's pretty long and pretty stale. So, we're certainly open to assistance in that direct department. Okay, so I will start by just talking a little bit about bias. It is an acronym. It happens to work perfectly. Thank you. The Biased Incidents and Actors Study. It's a multi-year project funded by the National Institute of Justice. As I said previously, it's modeled on PIRUS. So basically, it was tasked with the goal of trying to understand how someone radicalizes to the point that they are committing a hate crime, right? So it's all based on open sources, including court records, newspaper articles, watchdog reports, public police reports were available, and anything that we can find publicly. We don't have access to any kind of classified materials or anything like that. There are more than 100 variable fields. We looked specifically at the characteristics of the events. So things like, is it premeditated? Did it happen in public? And all the kinds of theories that are driven, variables that are driven by the theories of hate crime investigation. And then also at the background of the offenders, which is where most of our variables are located, which covers questions like, what is their background, education, employment, marital status, association with hate groups, consumption of certain kinds of online material, anything we thought that we could find consistently across the group, we included in our codebook. So we've completed a number of sort of short, brief analyses here that you can find on our website. We have a series of briefs that look more specifically at a couple of different dimensions. One is bias crime offenders, violent versus nonviolent. We do include both. And so we looked at some of the factors that seem to differentiate those two populations, as well as mass casualty offenders versus violent offenders, other violent offenders. And you can find all of that analysis on our website. I will go over this briefly, but I'm sure that most of you here know that we undertook this effort partly because there was just a really wide gap in our understanding of bias crime offenders. So we do have government data on hate crime offenders. Of course, the Hate Crime Statistics Act of 1990 did result in some research. The Uniform Crime Reporting Program does report hate crimes, but it doesn't have a huge amount of information on the offender. Right, so it has the age, gender, and ethnicity, but there's, of course, enormous problems of underreporting when it comes to the FBI statistics there, and it's a very limited profile anyway. There are a few other elements and ways that people have tried to do studies like this, but none of them have been as broad in terms of the variables that we look at, nor have they been national, and nor have they been over the period of time that we've looked at. None of those have been able to do all those things at once. So that was really our goal. I do want to talk about our challenges just because it certainly has impacted the makeup of our data. So one that we all know is that many hate crimes do not garner news coverage, right? Many go unsolved or unreported. So when we looked at the number of hate crimes that were reported in news media articles, the number that didn't have any information about the offender was pretty high because they were either unsolved or were not, the offender themselves was not the focus, and reporting quickly moved on to other issues. So there wasn't a lot there about most hate crimes. And then, of course, there is sometimes a lot more information available in court records, but we generally don't have access to state and local court records. We do have access to federal records, and we certainly relied on those very heavily in many cases. But it does mean that what we ended up with was a database that emphasized a lot more of the higher publicity hate crimes for various reasons. So I could tell you a little bit more about that process. We basically did a search between 1990 and 2018 of newspaper articles in LexisNexis and ProQuest, and what we found are 35,000 articles. So this was a big chunk of my life. I'm sure you can believe that. And we reviewed them for information about individual offenders. And I think we generated a list of about 4,000 offenders. And then we randomly selected them to determine whether or not they fit our criteria and whether or not there was sufficient information to be able to code them. So there were a number where we might have a name, and we're pretty confident in that name and maybe a little bit more information, but not enough to do this broader analysis. So that left us with fewer, especially from the early 90s. So we oversampled from those years because we wanted to get an actual, enough cases. We oversampled for a few years where we could see that FBI data tracking hate crimes had spiked. So, for example, immediately after 9/11. And then we oversampled from 2014 to 2018 because there, of course, has been an increase in the kind of information online generally, but also there had been increased reporting about hate crimes and possibly a growth in hate crimes. So we oversampled from those years also just to generate enough material. Our inclusion criteria was, of course, the year span, 1990 to 2018. We only looked at individuals over 18. We looked at, again, individuals who were residing in the United States. And then we also wanted to ensure that there was substantial evidence that the subject had committed the criminal act, at least partly because of bias against the victim or target's real or perceived identity characteristics. So we, differentiated that by race, nationality, sexual orientation, religious affiliation, gender, disability status, and the other sort of protected classes. We also, again, we had to be sure that there was enough information available in open source documents. So that certainly meant that there were certain kinds of cases that were probably less likely to be, that are underrepresented in our data. And I'll talk about that as we go. Okay, so jumping in here to the specific topic here, the analysis that we've done is an analysis of Levin and McDevitt's typology. So they've had a few different formulations of this over the years, but basically Levin and McDevitt determined that looking at their data that there were three different kinds of hate crimes. There were mission hate crimes, where individuals are driven by a goal to eliminate an entire community of people. These are individuals who are very committed. They have a mission to eliminate, and they, in their description, tend to see hate as a career. These may be people who have sort of, been in hate movements for a long time. So their sort of typical examples are mass casualty offenders that I'm sure we're all familiar with, Dylan Roof, that kind of thing. The second major category that they identified, and that's a very small mission, by the way, that's a very tiny number of the hate crime offenses that occur in the United States, right? I think there was about one out of several hundred in their case, in their end there. Defensive is the second type. Those are individuals who are acting because they, in direct response to what they perceive as a personal threat. So the typical case here is when for white people who live in a primarily white neighborhood and begin to experience that neighborhood's social change. So that might be, increasing racial or ethnic diversity in the neighborhood, or if they notice people identified as LGBTQ in their homes or in their, in their bar, places they might go in their neighborhood, restaurants, bars, that kind of thing. Another example they use is, women in the workplace. So these are people who are starting to feel feeling a direct threat to their community, who they identified, either as white people or straight people or anything like that. And they react to that explicitly. And usually they have a specific goal, right? They want to get African Americans out of their neighborhood, or they, don't want gay people to be at their local bar, that kind of thing. So they're sort of reacting to a specific event. And then finally, the third category they identified were thrill motivated offenders. And these are offenders who express a bias, and where bias is present in their crimes, but at the same time, they express a desire for fun or thrill, or frequently to gain status with their peers. So the sort of stereotypical event in this category might be a bunch of young people who go and say that they're looking for fun, they're bored, they're at a party, they're drinking, they say, we're going to go find someone to beat up, and they find someone to target based on LGBTQ status. So they might say, oh, we're going to go find a gay guy and beat him up, right? Gay bashing, if you will, to use the term that unfortunately was developed to describe this kind of event. So these are the three that they just said, and they said, okay, this is basically the universe of hate crimes, and these are the motivations that individuals have to commit those crimes. So I'm going to go through each of those motivations. I'm going to talk about how we coded them, how we identified the individuals in the bias data set as to whether or not they qualified for that category. And then I'm going to talk about, we did some statistical analysis to see if there were specific characteristics that were consistent with what Levin and McDevitt predicted would be the characteristics of that category. And then I'm going to talk about the implications of some of our findings, specifically in the context of what we know about the changing sort of landscape of hate crimes. Okay. Sorry. Okay, so mission offenders. So in our database has 966 individuals, and 200 of them were mission offenders. Now, that is a really serious overrepresentation of mission offenders. As I said before, because we're relying on open sources, we do have an overrepresentation of mass casualty offenders and really high publicity, highly violent offenders that would qualify for this kind of analysis here. Categorization here. So the N is not at all meant to be indicative of the percent of offenders that do this kind of crime. It's probably 100 times too many, but it did give us a lot of data to examine this category. So as you said before, the motivation as described by Levin and McDevitt was to rid the world of a particular group. So we coded this by looking at offenders who used explicitly eliminationist rhetoric. So if they talked about wanting to start a race war or wanting to rid the world of LGBTQ people or something like that. So we didn't require that they commit a mass casualty attack, but we did require that they were people who had, in the context of their offense, had committed to this very serious goal. And we'd had a sort of high standard for that, in that we didn't say, oh, just because you're in this hate group that sort of has this ideology, that we required that they specifically have expressed that. And we found that only 40% of the individuals in this category had attempted or committed mass casualty attacks, as defined by 4 or more injuries. So what we found is that actually people who had this sort of mission motivation in terms of, eliminationist rhetoric actually had participated in a number of different kinds of crimes, right? So there were people who were charged with weapons offenses, but had not actually undertaken any of this. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But there were certainly people that had this very clear mission motivation, but it had engaged in a broader number of types of crimes, a little more diverse than the sort of classic mass casualty attack. Again, Levin and McDevitt predicted that it would be premeditated and violent. We certainly saw that. We did see some non-premeditated and some non-violent. Again, that speaks, I think, to the wider range of offenses that this kind of mission offender might do. Sort of co-offended as well as lone actor. Both of those were present. It's actually a much higher percentage of lone actor attacks than any other category. In terms of the victims, that was fairly consistent in that they, would be especially likely to be members of racial, ethnic minorities or religious groups. But we found is that the largest percent of victims were African American. That's consistent with all of the categories. African Americans were by far the largest victim targeted in this kind of hate crime or in any kind of hate crime. But Jewish targets were nearly 30% of the victims of this kind of offender, and that was nearly 5 times as many as any other category. So Jewish targets were way overrepresented as victims of this kind of mission-motivated offender. And then again, 9.5 had no relationship with the victim, which is pretty predictable and consistent with what you'd expect, right? Because again, they're not motivated so much by personal relationships or anything here. They're really focused on this larger ideological mission. The biographical characteristics were to some extent consistent in that they were older. So a median age of 31, that's not old, but for criminologists there, obviously that's old for particularly violent crime among this cohort. So that was certainly older than any of the other categories. We saw 30.8% mental illness. That's higher than the other categories, but certainly is still a minority. And then we saw that there were a very high number of them who were in hate groups, 66.3. Again, that was pretty high, not the highest, but pretty high. And that 71% had a criminal history. So to some extent, that's consistent with the characteristics, but there was what we found is actually a fair amount of differentiation among that. So the main findings that we found in terms of what was consistent, what was different, what was expected, what was unexpected, was that, yes, this category does capture this particularly violent, sort of dedicated population of offenders. There's no question that they exist and that they do in some ways act apart from your typical, or in many ways act apart from your very typical hate crime offender. And again, they're especially likely to target Jewish victims. We do think that that's because especially in the white supremacist ideologies and movements. Anti-Semitism, from what we know from other research, is that anti-Semitism tends to be something that white supremacists learn as they become more and more involved and more dedicated. So sort of general racism, homophobia, those are things that circulate in the population. Certainly anti-Semitism does also, but that the sort of specific beliefs of white supremacists, that Jewish people occupy the American government, Zog, that kind of thing, are things that they have to learn through experiencing this subculture and movement. So we think that probably explains one of the reasons why anti-Semitic motivations were really high among this group. But again, this sort of eliminationist rhetoric, ideological dedication was present in a range of crimes. So, we know that there are people who have built careers out of, within the hate movement, or white supremacist movements, or other types of offenders, or other types of extremist movements, who are very unlikely, most of them, in fact, are very unlikely to undertake this kind of mass casualty event. And that may be because they don't want to get caught, because they don't think that it is an effective way to advance their mission, because that might cause, increased police attention. For all those reasons, it's very, very rare relative to the other numbers of crimes and certainly other kinds of activities that are undertaken by individuals with these long-term goals. However, we did find that there was a segment within this group that looked a little bit more in line with the portrayal by Levin and McDevitt. And so we isolated that by looking at lone actor terrorists. So we looked at all the folks who had identified this sort of mission goal. And then we said, okay, who are the lone actors here who committed mass casualty hate crimes? And that was a smaller segment. It was only about 38. But they were absolutely differentiated from the broader category, and that is that they were much more likely to have mental illness, and they were much less likely to be hate group leaders. I think there was only one hate group leader in that. So that's more consistent with the portrayal by McDevitt and Levin. But there, it was a pretty clear differentiation. So in the context of changing sort of shifts, the changes that we've seen in hate crime violence in recent years, I do think highlighting the importance of understanding mass casualty attacks does tell us something here. As you can see, this is data from the Global Terrorism Database. I don't mean to like mix all my data up, but I do want to use this just to contextualize some of what we're talking about. So what we've seen is that there's been a very clear growth in the attempted and successful mass casualty attacks on the right wing, most of which are motivated by a hate or bias prejudice, not all of them. But as they've grown, what we also can see about these offenders is that the most famous ones, especially the most successful ones, are people who have been inspired and informed by online communication and online participation. So outside of these hate groups, they are folks that are actually acting outside of the potential sort of gatekeeping of sort of old school style skinhead type hate groups, where they might have been to some extent even discouraged from this kind of attack that would draw so much attention to the group. So rather than coming out of this hate group offender model, they're really individuals who are radicalizing online independently and mobilizing in a different sort of dimension of that movement, or not entirely independent of it, certainly, but the radicalization process certainly looks a little bit different. So as we're thinking now about, again, mass casualty attacks as the biggest hate crimes that we see and that get a lot of attention, that individual profile, in some ways looks pretty different from what we might expect. But again, it's a tiny percent of actual hate crimes. It's probably much closer to 1%. Okay, so the defensive offenders. This was the largest category. McDevitt and Levin describe this as, again, as I said previously, people responding to this sort of specific perceived threat. The most common in their data is white people responding to racial changes in their neighborhood. That's the example they continually use. They also used in more recent years and updates the example of anti-Muslim actions undertaken after Islamist extremist terrorist attacks. And what we found is that is a pretty broad category, and that they're both of those stereotypical cases were present, but that they were a little bit different from one another. So we found about 71% were responding to this proximate threat, and about 29% were speaking in sort of national language that portrayed the community that they were defending on a national scale, right? So this is, really common language that we see in recent hate crimes in terms of, get out of my country, or, you don't belong here because of your national status, or rather than get out of my neighborhood, go to a different neighborhood, that kind of thing. So those are, to some extent, different crimes. One element that we weren't able to test for directly, but that we thought was implicated in our findings, was the location of the habitation of the offender with respect to the location of the crime. So obviously it's a very classic criminological question. Are offenders traveling to a different neighborhood or different location to commit their crime versus committing their crime where they live and sort of in their community? What we think is likely is that folks responding to national threats, they may be in their neighborhood. So they may, be speaking in terms of this sort of national community or national perceived threat, but acting within their neighborhood. But they're also traveling. So they also, if they're seeing their community as this bigger, larger community, then they are also likely to act outside of their own community. So we saw this in people traveling to mosques out of the way, that they might be familiar with, and portraying themselves as this kind of defensive offender. So that was one thing we saw that was a little bit different than the portrayal that we have typically seen in this category. Premeditated, again, I think that is typically, they suggested they'd be premeditated because they were responding to specific threats and trying to remedy them. But what we found is that a lot of this is also spontaneous. It's about 50-50. This can also occur when people are, out on the street living their lives and suddenly come into contact with individuals of, their race or nationality that they are particularly hostile to, and that they might actually not be premeditating these kinds of responses. We did see a higher percentage of co-offending and a higher percentage of violent here. Again, we can't actually test directly whether or not they were on the victim's territory, quote unquote territory, or on the offenders, but we certainly saw many instances of traveling to commit crimes. Again, this was a really high percentage of African American. I think that is probably with driven by a number of elements. One is just the high number of African Americans as targets in the sample in general. They're just, unfortunately, they are frequent targets of hate crime. And then also because of the sort of historical emphasis in this category that looks at defensive offenders as countering African American neighborhood integration. Okay, they are also, there's younger certainly than some of the older categories, slightly lower criminal history, and much lower members of hate groups. So again, our sort of view of this, that's a very broad category and certainly could be differentiated between proximate and national. We did find that in terms of background characteristics, the proximate and national offenders had some differences, and that also that this was not necessarily likely to be occurring on someone's turf, right? So if there's a hate crime, that says like, get out, you don't belong here. The initial typology would suggest that law enforcement should look at local actors, and this data suggests that that might not be the case. Again, this is especially relevant in the context of the changing landscape of hate crime today. And one of the important elements there is a change in the victims. So it's very clear that anti-Muslim, Arab, and other kinds of xenophobic motivations have become increasingly prevalent in hate crime offending over the course of the last 30 years. So as you can see here in orange, African-American victims have always been and remain the largest community of individuals impacted, the largest number of victims impacted by this kind of crime. But that has also grown as a percentage when you look at the growth here in anti-Muslim crime. Anti-Semitic has always also been an element here and has continued, waxed and waned a little bit, but has always continued to be a pretty big presence also. And then here, other bias is, some are anti-white, some are sort of anti-smaller religion, that kind of thing. Anti-LGBTQ crimes are here. And again, this is not perfect. It's also probably driven by what we know about reporting. Certain communities and certain types of crimes are less likely to be reported to law enforcement. And so we know that that impacts our data here also. Okay. Third category, thrill offenders. So again, these are, the sort of stereotypical offender here is someone who's really young. They're in a group of young men. They say that they're bored and they're looking for excitement or something interesting to impress one another. And they go out looking for victims, typically along some kind of common prejudice among young white males, which is, homophobia or racism, that kind of thing. We found that there was possibly some data here for differentiation between what we looked at as status offenders and thrill offenders, so that folks who are specifically looking to gain status within a hate group look a little bit more like your the hate group offenders just look a little bit more classically criminal than your potential thrill offenders without that. So we considered differentiating between those two and ended up not, because they weren't really statistically significant, but the ends were really low. So, but we will say that there are kind of two groups here. So people are often saying in the category, there are individuals who are acting because they've been told they have to commit a hate crime in order to get status within their hate group, that kind of thing. And then you have non-hate group associated young people who are, going out and acting violently based on the prejudices that they have. We found that they're about 70% spontaneous, which again, I think speaks to the fact that even while these are driven by, what you might think might be premeditated motivations, and that they're looking to go have fun, they're looking for an opportunity to impress their peers, that also these kinds of interactions that lead to these kinds of crimes happen spontaneously, and that the situational contexts are really relevant to what kind of crime occurs, right? So again, co-offending was very high. This is the highest among this group, and that's not surprising. They're very young. We didn't include teenagers here, but even without that, we had the youngest median age. Once again, the largest target were African Americans. And so again, our finding was here, our results sort of here was that this does capture biased crimes with younger groups of offenders, but that ideological dedication is certainly present. I think one of the conclusions by Levin and McDevitt was, well, this is one of the groups that you might be able to dissuade from this kind of offending. They're probably, not that committed. They're really motivated by other goals to be impressive or to, look good in front of their peers, that kind of thing. And what we found is that still there was, that's certainly true, but that there was still a large presence of ideological dedication. Okay, so after reviewing this, there were a couple of sort of global ways where I felt the typology kind of came short. And that was where they just really, and the few empirical pieces of research that have been done in this area found the same thing, which is that this analysis excludes mixed motives. So what we found is that the most common mixed motive were what we're calling escalation offenders. And these are individuals who, in the classic case, might be people who had some kind of negative interaction with someone, and then as it escalated, they started expressing prejudice and bias. So the really classic case is that a road rage incident, some sort of traffic incident, is escalated to violence or to harassment or something illegal when individuals, the offender, starts attacking the person and using, racist language or other kinds of insults. And the assumption here is one that, the question is, does it escalate to that extent because of the identity or perceived identity of the victim, right? So it's important to capture that, to say, look, this is how bias and prejudice circulates in our society, and people of color or people of protected classes and statuses are more likely to experience this kind of violence or this kind of harassment or other kind of attack because of their identity status. And whether or not there's another kind of motivation, if we exclude those kinds of attacks, we are not really capturing how bias crime offending occurs. So we thought it was really important to include that. We found that the majority are spontaneous. They're split, but a slightly higher level of co-offending, and they're more likely to be violent. So, again, when we talk about what does hate crime look like, this sort of mixed motive where someone might be reacting to some kind of other dispute does not mean that it's not going to end in a violent outcome. Again, the victims were almost 60% African American. The median age was 29, so it's about in the middle. Still really high rate of criminal histories, certainly compared with the general population, but lower than some other types, and a lower number of hate group members. So again, we felt that by adding this category, that we were capturing events that are often dismissed as not hate motivated, but we do think the ideological dedication is still present and still something worth identifying here. But we also found that the background characteristics were not terribly differentiated, which leads me to one of the second major critiques that we had of the typology, and that is that some of the defining motivational characteristics of offenders didn't really result in these exclusive profiles. So for one that we've talked about is that this idea that this eliminationist rhetoric, this ideological commitment, hate careers, movement leadership were present across all of the classifications. So you can see in this little quick chart we did here, over 90% of mission offenders had that, right? I think there's only a couple that didn't, and I can get into those. They're sort of weird cases, but they almost all did. It was generally definitional of inclusion in the category. But almost 40% of Thrill did. And then we had a number that we just couldn't categorize, we think based on a lack of information. So that's the none. And then also in escalation, there were still, 20 or 30%. Another element that we found that was not exclusive to a category, even that was supposed to be the defining characteristic, is that people might act defensively to, a specific event that they're triggered by, but that really does not speak to the long-term profile of an individual, but more of the specific context in which they find themselves, right? So that speaks to the larger issue, which is that sort of the offender level characteristics have a lot of overlap among the categories, right? So basically what you have are individuals who might be likely to commit a hate crime, and outside of the mission offenders who maybe are the most dedicated and the most violent, that they are people who are likely to offend, but they might offend in different ways depending on their situational context. So I know this is a really common criminological idea that the situational context is a driving factor in the crime. And one way we looked at that was by doing a quick sort of descriptive analysis using multiple correspondence analysis. And without getting into too much theory, this is basically a way to do principal component analysis, but with categorical variables. So what you can see here is basically we plotted all of the variables, including the typological classifications, against the cases. So all these little dots are the individual cases. And what you can see is there's a lot of overlap. Then the sort of the bright circles, the differently colored circles are are confidence ellipses. They're sort of rough locations of where they are in relation to one another. So you can see that there is certainly definite differentiation here between escalation and mission, but there's also a lot of overlap. So in order to try to understand this a little better, we broke it down between event level variables and offender level variables. So for event level, what we're looking at here is, was there property damage? Again, defensive, we have all the categories included. And then, was it spontaneous? Was the individual under the influence? So again, these are all the variables that speak to the specific crime itself. And what you can see here again is that mission is really on its own. It's dragged out here by mass casualty and some other factors, but that mission, there is some differentiation. It tends to be a kind of different attack. Escalation, again, you see the same thing. It's even further. It's driven especially by provocation. We can see the variables that are on the edges here means that those are the ones with the biggest pull in this movement and drawing these, what you can see here as circles apart. So these are the event level characteristics. But then when you go to just offender level characteristics, so again, we say, did they have children? Were they married? Were they in the military service? Did they have a criminal history? There's a huge amount of overlap. So even mission here has an enormous amount of overlap with these other types. So there are some that draw basically the married military children and trauma to some extent are drawing mission out. Largely, we think because mission offenders are older. And so they're more likely to be married and have military experience and those kinds of things because they're, a decade older or a little less maybe, but in some cases a decade older. And so just they have more life experience and have more likely to experience those kinds of changes. So, okay, what we have sort of settled on are recommended modifications for using and thinking about this typology, or that one would certainly add an escalation or possibly a mixed motive category that would capture hate crimes that are motivated by not just bias, but also, other sort of personal or immediate motives. Secondly, that we would differentiate between proximate and national defensive categories, and that's especially relevant when we're thinking about the way that our political culture has nationalized with mass media, how people are consuming information and identifying with national actors, national sources, that kind of thing. And then our third here is probably the most controversial and one that I think we have to think about a lot, but that is to make this usable, we have to allow offenders to be assigned to multiple categories. And so I think on the face of it, that is a little bit like, well, what's the point, right? If the goal of this kind of typology is to say, here are these kinds of crimes, here are the kinds of actors that do them. Yeah, it's not as helpful that way, but we think that that's a lot more realistic. But what it can do is say, these are the different kinds of crimes that we see. We can still think about them that way. And that we can, by focusing on those different types of crimes, we can look at the maybe several kinds of actors who might be involved in those kinds of crimes and target them generally for intervention or prevention. And just be a little bit more realistic about the fact that basically hate crime offenders are, more likely to offend in different ways, depending on the immediate circumstances and experiences. So that's all I have for now. Again, this is still a little bit of a work in progress, but I'm hoping that we can talk about the specifics, and I'm looking forward to it. So I'll stop there.
So at this point, we're gonna open up the floor. So if you have a question, feel free to just say something in the chat and we can unmute you. Or if you want to put your hand up, that also works. So I'll sort of start off with a question that I had. Given that you guys were analyzing open source media, um, did you feel that, or I mean, and this again, I understand if you might not be able to answer this question. Um, did you feel that there was some sort of bias in the reporting of the incidents in terms of like the narrative within the articles, or how did the articles necessarily align with these three categories that they were discussed? Like, yeah, I'll sort of
Mhm.
leave it there.
Mhm. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I will say that probably not super well, because one thing we found is that, so we had interns doing a lot of this coding, right? And these are certain, they're people who are trained and who, we teach a lot about hate crime. A lot of them have backgrounds in this, they had a really tough time categorizing this and doing this coding. And we basically ended up redoing all of it and that was probably our fault too. Like it's hard to specify these kind of subject, sort of amorphous categories of people. It's a hard thing to do. This is a lot harder than saying, do you find evidence that they, had a university degree or not? And so we didn't do any kind of narrative analysis of the newspaper reporting. One thing I will say is that it was sort of depressing and sort of encouraging on one hand, both in certain moments, to look back at 30 years of newspaper coverage and to spend a lot of time reading newspaper coverage of hate crimes, and to see that in some respects, the crimes and the coverage of the crimes had changed a lot. So like I was looking at a narrative from the 90s, or I'm sorry, a hate crime from the 90s is an homophobic hate crime. And they like cited a minister who was clearly just a massive homophobe, as like a source for this article. And it's like totally ridiculous. That would never happen now without saying, like homophobe, whoever. And so that, I thought, wow, that's where, coverage has really changed, where we look at who's an expert on this, right? But a lot of the especially racist hate crimes had just the same kinds of rhetoric and arguments had continued and spun for 30 years. So that was depressing in that sense.
Thank you. Our next question is going to come from Ravi. Ravi, if you could unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you for the presentation, Dr. Yates. I have this question about the data that you mentioned in the presentation. I see you're remembering 35,000 articles in the data set. Like, were these data set manually reviewed? Like, did you use any language to understand the sentiment of it, or just manually reviewed them?
Yeah, we manually reviewed them. We used Boolean search term to generate it. Okay. Yeah, and so we refined that. We developed that process and we refined it over a period of time. We did that, but we had interns and then us individually to pull out the names. We didn't do a sentiment analysis, which made it hard to answer the previous question. Like, we didn't determine whether or not the article was pro or con or something. We do have just sort of a flag for articles that we think may not have good information, that might have, there might be reporting that's biased one way or the other, but if there were an article that we really thought the information might be incorrect, we had a flag in our system of manual review.
Okay. And a follow-up on the manual review, like, is there any validation for somebody to select manual review is done, like, is the review properly done? Did you guys do any validation on it?
Yeah, so in the process of our training, we did some together, and then we reviewed not all of it, but certainly a bunch of it early on. A lot of the research assistants coding. We also in the process of the coding that occurred for the actual data, we had a pretty systematic process where we do a training set, and then we do peer coding, and we have them reconcile, and then we did generate. I think we ended up double coding, I want to say 10%, okay. And then ran a
interesting.
Yeah, it was a pretty good result. I'm sorry, I don't have that off the top of my head. I want to say it was like 70 or 80, something like that.
Yeah, I'm interested in the data set. Like, is it public or like, is there any way that the researchers can access them?
I'm sorry, is there such a what?
Is it public or is there any other way that researchers can access them?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the data set itself is going to be public. The sources aren't. That's not something we've done. I can talk to you about how we generated it, and if you're interested in that
Okay.
more, I can definitely do that. But
Yeah,
yeah,
I would.
the data set will be public, de-identified but public.
Oh, de-identified but public. Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, I can follow up with that. We are working on a few related problems that I think we could use some data set.
Yeah, and we actually, this is like a whole other paper that I haven't written yet either, but there were interesting findings, even though we didn't do a sentiment analysis, there were interesting findings in terms of like when the growth of newspaper coverage waxed and waned compared to, the number of cases that they were actually covering. We did track that a little bit. So there's some interesting findings looking at the coverage for sure.
Okay, great. Thanks for the answer.
Mhm.
I'll take over the other next question. I think Nadine had a question. Nadine, if you want to ask your question on the chat, you can, or you can unmute yourself and ask the question. Can you raise the hand if you want to ask the question? Okay, let me unmute you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, that was really interesting. Actually, my main question already got answered, which was whether the data set would be public. But my second question was going to be about whether there are any plans to kind of work on developing data sets outside of the US as well, like looking at kind of similar things and maybe comparing whether there are differences as well.
Yeah, so we don't have those plans. This is NIJ funded. They're certainly focused on, domestic in terms of the United States data. In the course of this project and other projects, I certainly have looked to find other kinds of data, and as I'm sure it sounds like, if you're in this field, there's not a lot of it. So it would be really interesting. The Pyrus data set that, again, is focused on extremism broadly, including, I think we had an overlap of about 300 cases that are also in Pyrus. There have been some efforts to replicate that elsewhere, notably, I think in Australia and maybe Germany. So yeah, there is certainly a replicability that would be interesting to look at. And I would certainly have lots of ideas for how, what we might find and what would be theoretically interesting there. So.
Yeah. Next, Victor has a question. Victor, you can go ahead and unmute and ask the question.
Not allowing you to unmute.
Okay, now I'm unmuted.
Okay.
Okay.
But I can't turn my video on, which is also fine. So Elizabeth, this is a very interesting presentation. I'm curious, what was the most surprising thing? And what was the thing that you looked at from this analysis and you go, oh wow, that's not what I was expecting?
Yeah. I think the enduring relevance, that's a weird word to use, the just enduring characteristics of there's not a typical hate crime, but what the most common hate crime was sort of surprising, maybe because we focused on, maybe just as researchers, we sometimes unfortunately focus on what's changing, what's different, and what's new. Because we're trying to understand, dynamics or something, but just the idea that African-American people are attacked on the street with horrible language and violence and, and threats is just an enduring characteristic of our culture. And that it's not surprising, I won't say that, but it struck me, again, as I said, that the coverage of that was so similar over 30 years. That's something that stayed with me, at least, I'll say that.
Thank you.
Is there any other question for Dr. Yates? Meanwhile, I have another question. Is there any time variable do you see in this data set? Like, as there was some election and there's a spike in these hate messages, or there is some other event happening somewhere in the country or outside the world. Does it affect your data set over the time?
Yeah. So I'm a sociologist. That's a really interesting question, something I think about a lot. This data isn't best posed to answer those questions because it's not comprehensive. It's representative of media coverage to some extent. And so it's really hard. Like, I think there's better data out there, or there hopefully should be better data out there to speak to some of that. I will say, there was certainly a growth in availability of information of cases starting, I want to say, around 2014. And certainly a growth of xenophobic cases. So, if you look at the timeline, and there are moments, I think, when there are certainly political events, but also demographic shifts that have resulted in an increase in certain types of hate crimes. So I want to say, like, around like the early 2000s, there actually aren't a lot of documented anti-Latinx crimes. Actually, that's something that I think is interesting, Victor, that I didn't say, is that I think that that's probably a pretty serious underreporting. But that might be other reasons too, that are that are real in terms of the data. But that you do see a jump there. That's sort of, I think, when the growth of the Latinx population in the U.S. There started to be a backlash to that. And you see that there, and then you see it later, more recently also, as I think that rhetoric has ramped up. So, we didn't do like multivariate analysis that you'd want to do with a comprehensive data set to say, okay, we're looking at changes in the economy and changes in this. And, we didn't do that, and it would be hard to do with our data. Probably would discourage it, frankly. But yeah, as someone who's looking at that data, I certainly think, I can imagine some of those, but I can't prove them.
I see. Yeah, we had small data set, and we did find some time dependent changes. So I thought I would ask him that question.
Yeah, sure.
And if there isn't any other question, I think we can wrap up the presentation. And I thank Dr. Vela, thanks to Dr. Yates for this wonderful presentation. We learned a lot. I think many of you might have questions. Feel free to follow up with Dr. Yates, and I'm definitely going to follow up on the data set. And Dr. Yates, thanks for the presentation. We'll meet you again later sometime.
Okay, thank you all to hosting this. I'm looking forward to next semester's seminars. Should be good.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you all.
Thanks.